The champagne flute was so cold that condensation gathered beneath my fingers when Vanessa Whitmore leaned close enough for me to smell the gardenia perfume on her skin. She never stopped smiling for the photographer. "If you care about Lucas the way you claim you do," she murmured, "you'll slip out before dessert. And after tonight, give us some space, a lot of it." Above us, strands of white lights stretched across the terrace of the Harborcrest Hotel in Baltimore. Nearly 200 guests were watching my only son dance with the woman he had married less than 6 hours earlier. Vanessa's smile remained flawless. Mine disappeared. I didn't argue. I didn't ask whether Lucas knew she was saying this. I simply placed my champagne beside a crystal vase filled with ivory roses, reached for my handbag, and stood. That was when something slid from the narrow inside pocket. A silver coin hit the marble floor with a sharp metallic click. It rolled once, circled beneath the edge of the table, and spun to a stop between Vanessa's shoes and mine. She looked down at it with the bored expression of someone noticing a dropped quarter. A man 3 seats away reacted differently. His chair scraped violently against the stone as he stood. For a second, I thought he might be ill. His face had lost its color. His eyes stayed fixed on the coin. Then they moved slowly to me. "Excuse me," he said, "were you ever known as Guardian 6? My fingers closed around the coin. I recognized him then. 20 years older, silver hair instead of brown, a little heavier through the shoulders. But I knew those eyes. "Not here," I replied quietly. I walked toward the elevator lobby, pulled my phone from my purse, and called a number I had hoped never to use during my son's wedding. When the woman on the other end answered, I gave her one instruction. "Freeze the family transfers." She didn't ask me to explain. "I'll handle it," she said. What no one in that ballroom understood was that Vanessa had just pushed open a door she didn't know existed. And to understand why, you have to understand who everyone believed I was. My name is Margaret Hale. I was 63 years old that evening. Widowed. A mother. And according to most of Vanessa's family, I was a slightly awkward retired nurse who had spent too much of her life around military people and had never developed much interest in fashionable society. Technically, the nursing part was true. The rest depended on how you told the story. I served 24 years as an Air Force flight nurse. Most of my work happened inside aircraft that were too loud for normal conversation, too cramped for hesitation, and frequently carrying people through the worst hours of their lives. You learn unusual things in places like that. You learn that fear does not always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like anger. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes the calmest person in the room is the one carrying the heaviest responsibility. And you learn very quickly that panic is contagious. My husband, Daniel, understood that world better than anyone. He was an aviation systems engineer with a habit of leaving coffee beside my elbow without saying a word whenever I was buried in reports after a long shift. We met at Ramstein during an assignment in Germany. For a while, we weren't sure children were going to happen for us. Then Lucas arrived. By the time he was 9, Daniel and I had drained most of our savings into a company that operated from a rented office beside a regional airport. We called it Horizon Medical Aviation. At the beginning, we owned 2 aging aircraft, several pieces of equipment held together by maintenance schedules and optimism, and enough money to make payroll if nothing major broke. Daniel handled engineering, maintenance systems, and aircraft acquisitions. I developed medical procedures, recruited clinical teams, trained crews, and flew whenever staffing became thin. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Over time, Horizon became one of the most respected medical transport operators in the region. We contracted with hospitals, veteran care programs, emergency networks, and disaster response organizations. To outsiders, it became a company. To Daniel and me, it remained an extension of a very simple rule we had lived by for years. When someone needs help and every minute matters, you go. Daniel died 8 years before Lucas's wedding. Pancreatic cancer took 11 months to reduce a broad-shouldered, endlessly curious man into someone who needed help lifting a water glass. During his final week, he asked me to bring the company records and trust documents to his hospital room. His hands had become too weak to hold papers for long, so I sat beside the bed and read everything aloud while he listened. Eventually, we placed Horizon's controlling interest, our cabin near Deep Creek Lake, and several investment accounts inside an independently administered family trust. Lucas was the principal beneficiary. But being the beneficiary was not the same thing as being in control. Daniel had seen too many founders spend 30 years building something only to hand it over to children who weren't prepared to protect it, or to new spouses who viewed marriage as an express lane to ownership. He insisted on one clause in particular. If any individual attempted to isolate, pressure, undermine the capacity of, or improperly remove a family beneficiary or trustee-connected family member for financial gain, the independent trustee had authority to suspend distributions, ownership transitions, and voting transfers until an outside review could be completed. When I first read the language, I told Daniel it sounded almost too defensive. He was lying against two pillows, exhausted, but he still smiled. "Meg," he said, "a safeguard isn't the same thing as distrust. Sometimes protecting people means preparing for the thing you hope never happens." I never forgot that sentence. Lucas knew about the trust. He did not know every provision. Daniel and I had agreed that the details should be explained gradually as Lucas took on more responsibility. At 32, he became Horizon's chief operating officer. He was smart. He worked hard. People liked him. But there was a weakness in him I spent years pretending wasn't dangerous. Lucas hated conflict. He mistook avoiding confrontation for kindness. And if you spend enough years doing that, eventually you start sacrificing the person who complains least. Then he met Vanessa Whitmore. The first time I met her, I understood immediately why Lucas had fallen in love with her. She was poised, attentive, funny without trying too hard, and exceptionally good at making someone feel as though she had been waiting all evening to speak with them. Her father, Richard Whitmore, owned a regional private hospital network called Whitmore Health Partners. Vanessa remembered my birthday after meeting me once. She sent handwritten thank you notes. She asked thoughtful questions about Daniel. 6 months into the relationship, she started calling me Mom. I remember thinking Lucas had found someone who valued family. A year later, she began moving me out of his life. Not dramatically. That would have been easier to recognize. It happened through small adjustments. Our Sunday dinners disappeared because Vanessa said newly engaged couples needed weekends to themselves. The annual trip to our lake cabin was skipped because Vanessa found the place too rustic. At Horizon's holiday banquet, my usual seat beside Lucas was moved to a table near the catering station because, according to Vanessa, the seating chart needed to better reflect current leadership. Whenever I questioned one of these changes, she gave me the same patient smile. "We're just trying to establish some healthier boundaries, Margaret." A week later, Lucas used almost the exact same phrase. I remember looking at him across my kitchen island. "Is that how you see it too?" He stared into his coffee. "I think everybody just needs a little room." He looked exhausted. I could have pushed. I didn't. I had watched mothers become the subject of family complaints because they refused to accept that adult children build new lives. I didn't want to become that woman. So I told myself traditions change. Children grow up. Marriage requires adjustment. I stepped backward. Then I stepped backward again. When Vanessa requested an independent valuation of Horizon, I said nothing. When she toured the lake cabin with an interior designer and discussed removing Daniel's workshop, I said nothing. When our attorney forwarded me an email Vanessa had sent asking whether a spouse could acquire indirect voting rights through a trust beneficiary, I printed it. I read it twice. Then I placed it in a folder inside my desk. And I did nothing. That was the part one eventually had to admit to myself. People love to say betrayal arrived without warning. Sometimes it does. But sometimes the warnings are everywhere. You just keep giving them gentler names because the real name would require you to act. Lucas and Vanessa chose the Harborcrest Hotel for their wedding, a luxury property overlooking Baltimore's Inner Harbor. The Whitmores paid for the flowers, entertainment, and reception design. I paid for the ceremony itself and flew Daniel's older sister, Barbara, in from Phoenix. My name was not printed anywhere in the wedding program. I noticed. I pretended not to. At the rehearsal dinner, Richard stood with his wineglass raised and gave a speech welcoming Lucas into what he called a family that understands institutions, stewardship, and legacy. Then he smiled in my direction. Lucas was raised, of course, by a wonderfully private woman. Margaret always seemed much happier around airplanes and hospital corridors than cocktail parties. A few people laughed. Not cruelly. That almost made it worse. Lucas rubbed the back of his neck. His eyes dropped toward his plate. He never corrected Richard. Later, Barbara found me near the elevators. Danny would have made him answer that. I knew exactly who she meant. So should Lucas, I said. Barbara studied me for a moment. Are you going to talk to him? Not tonight. The answer tasted like defeat. The following morning, the wedding coordinator approached me while bridesmaids were moving through the ballroom. She looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Hale, I wanted you to know there's been a schedule adjustment. What adjustment? The mother-son dance has been removed. I looked at the printed timeline in her hand. Why? I was told we're running long. 10 minutes later, I learned Vanessa had added an 11-minute video montage about her childhood. Daniel's framed memorial photograph had also been moved from the guest book table and placed behind a decorative column because the dark wood frame supposedly interfered with the floral palette. I carried it back myself. Vanessa noticed. She crossed the room before I had finished straightening it. Margaret. Her voice stayed low because two photographers were nearby. I asked the planner to put that somewhere less visible. It belongs beside the guest book. It doesn't fit the display. He was Lucas's father. Her jaw tightened. This is Lucas's wedding, not a memorial service. I looked at her without speaking. She continued. Please don't start reorganizing things because you're feeling emotional. This weekend has been carefully planned. Years earlier, I might have answered immediately. Instead, an old professional instinct surfaced. Observe first. React second. I noticed the coordinator standing 8 feet away. Her pen had stopped moving. She was listening. I understand, I said. Vanessa seemed almost disappointed. The ceremony itself was beautiful. When Vanessa entered, Lucas cried. Watching him standing beneath the flowers, I suddenly saw a 6-year-old boy perched on a chair beside Daniel, stirring pancake batter with both hands. I remembered Daniel carrying him from the car when he fell asleep on long drives. I remembered school concerts, scraped knees, college move-in day. That is the difficulty with being hurt by family. Love doesn't disappear just because disappointment arrives. Sometimes love is what makes disappointment unbearable. During the reception, Vanessa introduced me to one of Richard's board members. This is Lucas's mother, Margaret. She used to do some nursing in the Air Force. Some nursing. I had stabilized critical patients inside vibrating aircraft. I had kept an infant breathing during a hurricane evacuation. I had once spent an entire flight talking to an injured 19-year-old about his little sister because he was terrified he would never see her again. But explaining any of that would have made me sound as though I needed applause. So I shook the man's hand. Nice to meet you. The man sitting beside him was the one who later recognized the coin. Retired Major General Malcolm Rourke. During my military career, General Rourke had overseen several aeromedical units under the command structure where I served. After retirement, he became chairman of the American Veterans Rehabilitation Alliance. Richard Whitmore had been pursuing his endorsement for a major rehabilitation facility for months. I recognized General Rourke when I first saw him at the table. I didn't expect him to recognize me. There had been thousands of faces over the years. But he remembered a call sign. Guardian 6. 21 years earlier, I had been aboard an aeromedical evacuation aircraft carrying 14 injured service members when we suffered a sudden cabin pressure emergency above a severe sandstorm. One medic lost consciousness during the initial chaos. Another suffered a fractured arm. 2 patient litters broke free from their locking system. Equipment shifted across the cabin. For the next 43 minutes, titles and rank meant very little. There was only the work in front of us. I secured loose equipment using cargo straps. I manually ventilated one patient when his equipment failed. I guided a young medic through an emergency procedure while keeping another patient stable. By the time we approached the runway, one engine was showing signs of serious trouble. We landed. Every patient made it off that aircraft alive. The report later credited the entire crew, as it should have. One of those patients happened to be Malcolm Rourke's son. General Rourke came to see me 2 days later at the military hospital. I had a swollen eye, bruised ribs, and absolutely no patience for anyone calling me heroic while 2 members of my crew were still recovering. He handed me a silver command coin. "Don't keep this for yourself," he told me, "keep it for everyone who got to go home." I carried it for 21 years. And when Vanessa asked me to vanish from my son's life, that coin fell onto the ballroom floor between us. After recognizing it, General Rourke walked away with his phone. He wasn't trying to create a scene. He was verifying a memory. Meanwhile, I called Natalie Chen. Natalie was the independent trustee Daniel and I had selected years earlier. "Freeze the family transfers," I told her. There was a 2-second silence. "Do you believe the protective provision applies?" "Yes." "Then consider it active. I can be at the hotel in about half an hour." I could have left. Part of me wanted to. But walking away would have given Vanessa exactly what she needed. By morning, the story would have been that Margaret Hale became overwhelmed at her son's wedding and stormed out because she couldn't handle losing control. So I stayed. I shook hands. I thanked servers. I stood for photographs. Then I returned to the chair assigned to me near the kitchen entrance. If you've ever been praised for being strong by people who benefited from never asking whether you were tired, you may understand what that chair represented. Families do not always exile someone by slamming a door. Sometimes they simply move that person a few feet farther away from the center every year. Eventually, the person begins wondering whether they ever belonged there at all. At 9:15, Richard Whitmore stepped onto the stage. He tapped a spoon lightly against his champagne glass. "I believe we have time for one final surprise." A screen descended behind the band. The Horizon Medical Aviation logo appeared. Next to it was the Whitmore Health Partners logo. My entire body became still. Richard began describing what he called the future of integrated medical transportation and regional rehabilitation. He spoke about combining resources, expanding service networks, uniting 2 families and 2 organizations with shared values. People began applauding. I looked at Lucas. He wasn't smiling. He looked genuinely confused. Vanessa leaned close to him and whispered something. Then she took his hand. Richard invited the bride and groom onto the stage for photographs in front of a ceremonial signing table. There was no approved deal. No agreement. No authorization from Horizon's board. No permission to use the company logo. Nothing. Vanessa hadn't merely spent a year making me smaller inside my son's life. She and her father were publicly presenting Horizon as though it had already become part of their family's portfolio. I stood. "The announcement you just made has not been approved." The applause died badly. Several people continued clapping for another second before realizing everyone around them had stopped. Richard stared at me. Vanessa immediately reached for the microphone. "Margaret, please." Her expression was soft. Almost compassionate. "That's exactly the kind of interruption Lucas and I hoped to avoid tonight. We agreed that future business matters would be handled by our generation." Lucas turned toward her. "That's not what I agreed to." Vanessa's smile remained in place. "We talked about it. We talked about possibilities." She looked back at me. "You've been carrying a lot lately. Maybe someone could walk you upstairs so you can rest." And there it was. Not anger. Not an accusation. Something more effective. Concern. Concern could make resistance look irrational. Concern could make humiliation look like care. A hotel security supervisor took several uncertain steps toward me. Lucas came down from the stage. He stopped before reaching me. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we please not do this here?" He still didn't understand. He was asking me to absorb another insult so the rest of the room wouldn't become uncomfortable. "I didn't create this situation," I said. Vanessa's composure finally cracked around the edges. You never allow anyone to move forward. Everything Daniel left behind has to remain exactly the way you want it because you need to be the person in control. The security supervisor extended a hand toward my elbow. Before he touched me, a voice came from Richard's table. Keep your hands off Colonel Hale. Everyone turned. General Malcolm Rourke was standing. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. I had heard that tone cut through aircraft hangars, briefing rooms, and emergency operations centers. The guard stopped immediately. General Rourke walked toward me holding his phone. An old photograph filled the screen. He studied my face. Then he asked, "Guardian 6?" I gave him a small nod. He faced the ballroom. I think everyone here has been given a rather incomplete introduction to Margaret Hale. Silence spread across the terrace. She was described to me tonight as someone who once did some nursing in the military. He looked toward Vanessa. That description leaves out nearly everything that matters. Nobody moved. 21 years ago, an aeromedical evacuation aircraft transporting 14 injured American service members suffered a major emergency while flying in severe conditions. Multiple crew members were incapacitated. Equipment failed. The aircraft itself was in trouble. He lifted his phone. The old photograph showed me beside a transport aircraft. I was younger. Thinner. A bandage covered part of my forehead. One sleeve was stained from the work we had done inside the cabin. Margaret Hale kept that medical cabin functioning until they reached the ground. Every patient survived. He paused. My son was one of those patients. Someone near the far side of the terrace lowered a fork onto a plate. The tiny sound seemed incredibly loud. General Rourke continued. My son has a wife, a career, and 3 children now. My family has never forgotten the people who brought him home. Vanessa slowly lowered the microphone. General Rourke looked directly at her. So before anyone in this room casually suggests that this woman is confused, overwhelmed, or unable to handle pressure, you may want to reconsider who you're talking about. Richard stepped forward. General, I assure you, none of us knew. General Rourke's expression barely changed. You didn't know because apparently nobody here considered her worth knowing. The elevator doors opened behind us. Natalie Chen walked onto the terrace carrying a dark leather portfolio. Beside her was Dr. Peter Caldwell, chairman of Horizon Medical Aviation's board and a retired military trauma surgeon. Natalie walked straight toward me. It's done, Margaret. Vanessa frowned. What's done? Natalie turned toward Lucas. The Hale Family Trust owns 51% of Horizon Medical Aviation. The planned voting transfer to Lucas has not occurred. Effective this evening, all succession distributions, transfer rights, and related approvals are suspended. The color drained from Richard's face. Vanessa stared at Lucas. Can she actually do that? Natalie answered before he could. The trustee can, and I did. She opened the portfolio. No merger, strategic partnership, asset pledge, or ownership commitment involving Horizon may be executed without both trustee compliance and the appropriate board authorization. Her eyes moved toward the screen displaying the 2 company logos. Neither exists. Then she continued. Approximately 30 minutes ago, Margaret reported conduct potentially falling under the trust's protective provision, including efforts to isolate a protected family member while financial representations concerning trust-controlled assets were being made publicly. Lucas looked as though someone had rearranged the room around him. Natalie continued. The clause your father created allows the trustee to suspend pending distributions and succession rights while an independent investigation is conducted. Vanessa grabbed Lucas's arm. This is ridiculous. She can't take your future away because she's angry. Natalie shook her head. This provision wasn't designed to punish Lucas. Her voice softened slightly. It was written to protect him. That was the second revelation nobody had expected. Lucas had always assumed Horizon would eventually become his to control. Vanessa had behaved as though marrying Lucas placed that future within reach. And Richard had apparently built an entire expansion concept around access to Horizon's aircraft. Contracts, medical network, and capital. But expectation was not ownership. Dr. Caldwell stepped forward. There's another issue. Richard looked at him. What issue? The board has received documentation concerning requests for confidential valuation information, potential spousal voting structures, and accelerated ownership transfer scenarios. Lucas turned toward Vanessa. Dr. Caldwell continued. Several requests were initiated before your engagement was publicly announced. Lucas stared at his wife. For the first time all evening, Vanessa seemed unsure where to look. Her grip tightened around the microphone. I was preparing for our future. Lucas's voice came slowly. You were preparing to own something. For both of us. You didn't tell me. I knew you'd hesitate. Then he asked the question that changed his face before she even answered. Did you tell my mother she should leave tonight? Vanessa said nothing for several seconds. Finally, she looked at me. I told her we needed boundaries. I had heard that word enough. No, I said, you needed me out of the way. I never spoke directly to her again that night. General Rourke asked that Horizon's logo be removed from the presentation immediately. Dr. Caldwell informed Richard that any potential business discussions with Whitmore Health Partners were suspended until the board completed an ethics review. Then General Rourke delivered another blow. He informed Richard that his veterans organization would not support any hospital leadership team that casually used questions about a person's stability as leverage during a financial dispute. Richard didn't argue. Men like Richard Whitmore understand power. More importantly, they recognize the exact moment it moves away from them. After midnight, I stood alone beside the tall windows overlooking Baltimore's harbor. Most of the guests had left. There had been no final dance. No sparkling send-off. Vanessa had gone upstairs with her parents. General Rourke had already placed the silver coin back into my hand. Lucas found me near the glass. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I didn't know any of this. His eyes were red. I believed he was hurting. But tears are not the same thing as accountability. Sometimes people cry because the truth has become painful to live with. Not because they have fully understood what they did. You knew she was pushing me farther away, I said. He looked down. I thought I could straighten everything out after the wedding. That means you expected me to tolerate it until then. His eyes closed. I was trying to stop everybody from fighting. You succeeded. He looked confused. I continued. Everyone stayed comfortable except me. He covered his face with both hands. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he lowered them. I should have defended you. Yes. The word came easily. I didn't soften it. I had spent most of Lucas's life protecting him from the full weight of consequences. I had believed that was part of motherhood. If something painful was coming toward him, I stepped in front of it. If he made a mistake, I helped him recover. If he disappointed me, I found a way to make the disappointment easier for him to carry. Standing beside those windows, I finally understood what Daniel had seen when he insisted on that clause years earlier. A safeguard isn't distrust. Sometimes love means refusing to keep rescuing someone from the consequences that might finally teach them to stand. Lucas did not go back to the bridal suite. The next morning, he met with Natalie. He did not ask her to reverse the suspension. I noticed that. His marriage lasted 4 months. I never asked him to leave Vanessa. Not once. Instead, he started counseling. He reviewed the emails collected during the trust investigation. He discovered that Vanessa had contacted investment groups before the wedding to discuss financing models based partly on the future Horizon shares she expected Lucas to receive. There were questions about leveraging those expected interests. Questions about board influence. Questions about restructuring after transfer. By the time Lucas filed for divorce, he did it quietly. There was no public statement. No dramatic confrontation. No attempt to make himself look heroic. He simply stopped pretending he hadn't seen what was in front of him. The trust review lasted 9 months. Lucas kept his job at Horizon, but the board reduced his authority. He entered an executive governance program and temporarily lost approval power over several major financial decisions. He accepted every restriction without complaint. That mattered to me more than any apology he could have made. Apologies are words. Changed behavior costs something. We rebuilt our relationship slowly. Not in expensive restaurants. Not during emotional family summits. We did it over coffee at a diner near the airport. At my kitchen table. During quiet drives. And eventually at the lake cabin Vanessa had once wanted completely redesigned. The first weekend Lucas came there with me again. He walked through the mudroom and stopped. Daniel's old fishing hat still hung from a wooden hook beside the back door. Lucas reached up and touched the brim. "I let somebody convince me this place was embarrassing," he said. I didn't answer. He continued. "I let her make me embarrassed by everything that made our family what it was." I waited. Then he looked at me. "And I made you absorb the cost because I didn't want to confront her." "That," I said, "is closer to what happened." He nodded. A year after the wedding, Horizon created a scholarship and training program for civilian flight nurses moving into veteran emergency care services. Lucas proposed naming the program after me. I refused. I had spent too many years working beside people whose names would never appear on buildings. We named the program after the cruise. General Rourke came to the opening ceremony. His son came too. He walked with a cane. He also brought photographs of his grandchildren. When he hugged me, I remembered that aircraft 21 years earlier. The vibration beneath my boots. The harsh cabin lights. The sound of equipment moving. 14 frightened people trying to breathe. For most of my life, I thought strength meant remaining useful. Remaining calm. Carrying more. Needing less. Service taught me how to carry people through danger. Motherhood taught me something much harder. If you carry someone long after they are capable of walking, eventually your love can become part of the reason they never learn to stand. I did not destroy my son's wedding. The truth is much simpler. I stopped cooperating with the idea that a beautiful ceremony could transform control into love. Vanessa believed the greatest favor I could give Lucas was to disappear. What she never understood was that I had already been disappearing for years. One cancelled Sunday dinner at a time. One chair moved farther from the family table. One photograph hidden behind a column. One sentence I decided not to challenge. One boundary I accepted because refusing it might make me look difficult. One silence after another. The company was never the most important thing Daniel protected. Neither was the cabin. Neither were the investments. The most valuable thing he left us was a structure strong enough to force the truth into the open when none of us had the courage to do it ourselves. For Lucas, that truth was painful. Peace purchased with someone else's dignity is not peace. For me, the truth was different. Silence can be strength. But silence offered endlessly to people who misuse it eventually becomes permission. For years, people mistook my quietness for weakness because they had no idea what that quiet had already survived. By the end of that night, some of them finally understood. But strangely enough, I no longer needed them to. I only needed to stop allowing their misunderstanding to decide how much of myself I was willing to erase.